Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the Women in Public Policy Program seminar. I think you all know that I'm Victoria Budson, Executive Director here at the Women in Public Policy Program. Our work focuses on 4 key areas: closing gaps in political participation, economic opportunity, education, and health. And today, Daniel Manne is joining us. And Daniel has been a fellow with us over this past year and will be with us again next year before he continues on to be a postdoctoral associate at the program in Ethics and Public Life at Cornell University. So we're thrilled that we get to work with him for another year. He received his LLM from the law school here, and while he was doing his thesis, he focused on looking at domestic violence reform and the state response in the United States, and while working with us, is turning his thesis into a book, making a comprehensive guide to domestic violence policy reform in the United States. Before being in the academic community, he worked at Foley, Hoag, and Elliott, and spent much of his time doing pro bono cases on domestic violence, and we're thrilled that we have pulled you over into academia from the side of practice, because it really is those who've had to work within the current set of laws who best understand how policy needs to look different to get the outcomes that we're all seeking. Before joining us at the law school, he received his bachelor's degree from the University of Fairbanks, Alaska, and his JD from Boston University. We are thrilled that you eventually get to go into Ithaca, but are terribly sorry at some point you will leave us. So thanks so much.
Thank you very much, Victoria. And thank you to everyone at WAPPP for helping me out this year. It has been a pleasure to be here. I love this weekly seminar, so just thank you to Teresa and Danielle and everybody. So, I'm going to be talking about domestic violence policy. But before I get started on what I'm going to talk about, I first want to talk about what I'm not going to talk about. Just to be clear, it's an enormous topic. I can't cover everything. What I'm not going to talk about is at least consciously done. So let me tell you what I'm not going to talk about. First, the international situation. I'm only going to be talking about policy here in the United States. So why? First of all, it's a local problem. Domestic violence isn't easily dealt with international organizations because each community deals with the problem in different ways or not at all. So it's really hard to get international support to deal with this particular problem. Likewise, it's also cultural. A recent World Health Organization study showed that a significant percentage of Muslim women believe that their husbands have the right to chastise them, so to speak. It cuts across different cultural borders. That's not my area of expertise. So finally, I'm an American. I was trained in American law. It's what I know. So that's what I'm going to be talking about. Also, I'm not going to be talking about woman against man violence. There's been a real backlash amongst so-called men's rights advocates, saying that a significant percentage, perhaps as much as 40% of domestic violence is done by women against men. I think that number is ridiculous, but it's when you have situations in which both people were violent, who was the first instigator, who was the primary aggressor? It's a difficult question. I'm not going to be dealing with that. Why? Because it means something different when a woman hits a man than when a man hits a woman. And I'm going to be talking about that in depth. And more specifically, men face different problems when coming out of a violent relationship than women do. Women face significant hurdles that men simply don't have to deal with. Finally, I'm not going to talk about same-sex violence. Why? It's not studied. It is almost impossible to get grant funding to study same-sex violence. They see same-sex and it goes in the wastebasket. So the best data, and these are poor data, suggests that in same-sex male relationships, domestic violence occurs at about the same rate as in heterosexual relationships. As far as same-sex women relationships go, it's almost unheard of. It almost never happens. So, if you're going to criticize me about what I'm choosing to talk about, feel free to say that this presentation is Amerocentric, gender biased, and heteronormative. It is. Okay, so what is it? What is domestic violence? So here's a wall of text. The term domestic violence refers to violence or the threat of violence perpetrated against an intimate partner, family member, or cohabitator. The violence can take the form of simple assault, choking, restraining, threats with a weapon, verbal threats, and even homicide. It is often associated with other forms of abuse, including emotional and sexual. In many cases, perpetrators of domestic violence seek to isolate and control their victim by limiting their access to money, family, friends, and other means of support. This is from the International Encyclopedia of Ethics, forthcoming. I know because I wrote it, along with Susan Bryson from Dartmouth. So, domestic violence, that's what it is. Why do we care? It's the 21st century, why are we still talking about domestic violence? And I hope we all agree that the reason why is because it's a moral imperative. Because being secure in your person, in your home, in your most intimate relationships should be a fundamental right. And I hope we all see that. But for those of us who are cynics or economists, policymakers, it's hard to quantify that. So, and there are lots of moral imperatives. Feeding the hungry, giving homes to the homeless. So why are we talking about domestic violence specifically? Well, let's quantify it a little bit. Costs the United States roughly $8.3 billion a year. This number comes from the Centers for Disease Control. Just to put $8.3 billion a year in perspective, President Obama is trying to pass the Warren Buffett rule right now, which would require people who earn over $1 million a year for every dollar over $1 million pay 30% taxes instead of 15%. Over 10 years, the Congressional Budget Office says that might net the federal government $80 billion. Well, over 10 years, domestic violence is going to cost more money than that. Why else? 1,600 women die every year in the United States because of intimate partner violence. That's 1/3 of all female murder victims. You're more likely to be killed by your husband or your ex or your partner than by any other random person. I know, that's a plurality, that's a third. But that's more than 4 women every day. Why do we care about domestic violence? It's a vicious cycle. 80% of male abusers witnessed violence in their childhood home. So, it's a learned behavior. Perhaps that means we can do something about it. So, why do we care? More scary facts. 1 out of 3 women have experienced some form of domestic violence, be it threats, be it actual assault and battery, rape. It's the leading cause of injury to women 15 to 44 in the United States. 1.3 million women are abused every year, and 7.8 million women have been raped at some point in their lives by an intimate partner. Yeah, please, questions anytime.
About the statistic, the leading cause of injury to women in the U.S., 15 to 44. Is that a marker, the 15 to 44, because that's the parameter of what's been studied?
Yes.
Meaning that we don't have any expectation that it drops off after looking at 44 to 75?
No, that's a great question. No, I think the reason why is other things become more likely after 45, not that violence goes down, but rather other things become more likely. As you get older, you're more likely to experience, falling, other types of basic injury. But no, you're right. There's those data do not in any way suggest that violence goes down over time.
And Daniel, one other clarification question on the statistics of women abused and women raped. We sort of think of those things as being chronically underreported.
Oh.
Are these numbers, the ones you're showing, are likely to be underestimates?
Report rate is about 50%.
Yeah.
That's a great. That's, we don't know, but the best guess is about 50%. These are the numbers projected. These are projected numbers, not actual reported. So, great question. These numbers are a combination from the Department of Justice, Centers for Disease Control, and the World Health Organization. So all these are official numbers. They're projected, not actual reported. Great question. And other questions. At any time, I'm a lawyer. I'm trained to be interrupted and be polite about it. So please feel free. So yes, between 40 and 60% of calls to police during the nighttime are related to domestic violence, and a report rate of about 50%. The most common reason why people don't report domestic violence, anyone want to guess?
fear of the man, or fear of the,
That's
losing their children. Most of them losing their children follow, so they fear to lose their children and then to make the man just be.
that is definitely one of the chief reasons, yes. Fear and intimidation, and I will get to that. But actually, the number one reported reason, police aren't going to do anything. How depressing is that? And the second most common reason, because it's private. Because it's the type of thing that shouldn't be reported. For those women who did report and the police showed up, only 17% were given written literature about resources that were available to abused women. 17%. So hopefully we now agree that this situation is unacceptable. But let's keep in mind where we were a couple hundred years ago. Hopefully what I'm proposing is seems less dramatic when you consider the fact that under British common law, the source for all American law, it was perfectly legal for the husband to beat his wife. He was legally responsible for any crimes or torts that she committed, and as such, it was only appropriate that he be allowed to beat her to prevent her from committing a tort. Sort of ironic that he gets to commit a tort against her so that she won't commit any. But consider where we've come from. This is from William Blackstone. All lawyers are familiar with him. He's sort of he collected all of the British common laws into his commentaries in the 18th century. Furthermore, when a husband killed his wife, it was as if he'd killed a stranger, legally speaking, because he owed her no special duty, no duty beyond what you owe to a stranger. However, if a wife killed her husband, it is as if she'd committed regicide, that is, murder of a monarch. Why? Because she'd killed her master and thus thrown aside all social order. If you're willing to kill your master, it means you no longer consider yourself bound by laws. So, we've come a long way. Where are we now? Domestic violence is a criminal justice matter, obviously. I mean, that's how we deal with crime. It's considered crime, just like any other crime. What does that mean? Well, our criminal justice system is reactive. And that's not necessarily a bad thing. It's what you generally want from a criminal justice system. If you're the victim of a crime, you call the police, you report it. Your bike is stolen, you call the police, they start looking for your bike. They start looking for the guy who did it. There's something particularly wrong with that in general, but we'll deal with why in domestic violence it may be problematic. Furthermore, victims are responsible for their own protection. What do I mean by that? I mean, of course, the police are there to protect you, but every step in the process of extracting yourself from a violent situation, the woman is responsible for. She's responsible for fleeing the abusive situation. She's responsible for learning about seeking every resource that might be available to her. She's required to go to court to get a protection order. Everything is in her hands. Nothing is done for her. The focus of the criminal justice system, emphasis on criminal, it's to prosecute and punish perpetrators. It's not victim-oriented, it's perpetrator-oriented. And domestic violence in this country is left almost exclusively to the states. In 1994, the federal government passed the Violence Against Women Act, or VAWA. The chief provision of that was struck down by the Supreme Court in the United States v. Morrison in 2000, a pretty controversial 5-4 opinion. VAWA still exists. It does some things, but it's mostly grants to the states to deal with interstate commerce with this is dealing mostly with rape and college campuses and things like that, not so much domestic violence.
When the Supreme Court struck it, what did they actually take out of the act?
That's a great question. It was called the civil rights provision, and it was the most controversial part of it. Basically, the civil rights provision stated that any woman who'd been a victim of gender-motivated crime could sue the aggressor in federal court for damages. Question whether or not that's really what victims are looking for, but it was extremely controversial. William Rehnquist, who was Chief Justice at the time, was very much against it. He thought federal court shouldn't be dealing with what he thought were private family matters. And it was eventually struck down. It was very rarely used. Very few women actually sued under the civil rights provision while it was in effect.
Just a quick follow-up, and I know this is U.S. based, but do other countries have laws similar to that, to the violence against women, but to that provision specifically that got removed?
It's a good question. Not really, mostly because we have a bifurcated court system that most other countries don't have. This allowed women to sue in federal court. You can sue in state court already, but the reason why this seemed necessary is, one, state courts are clogged, just unbelievably clogged, and also because there is a perceived bias in state courts against women bringing these types of cases. So it was hoped this would resolve it. That's a good question. So not really, because it's not really necessary. So domestic violence, left to the states. The other thing that means is it's extremely difficult across borders. And when I say borders, I don't just mean state borders, I also mean local borders. If you get a protection order in Middlesex County and you go to work in Suffolk County, you may have a hard time getting your protection order enforced in Suffolk County. So I'm going to deal with, I talked about why treating as a criminal justice matter might be a problem. The first is that the system is reactive. Makes sense for most crimes, not so much DV. Why? Well, first of all, as you said, we have a real problem with reporting. 50% or less. Part of the reason is intimidation and fear. That's pretty straightforward. Women are afraid to come forward and report the crime. If the system only responds when a report's been made, underreporting, serious problem. Reporting increases the risk of being killed. It's linked with that. I don't have the data in here, but it's estimated that a woman attempting to leave a violent relationship increases her mortality risk by almost 75%. So obviously this is a form of escalation. It puts her at risk. Punishment of the criminal actor is not necessarily the goal of the victim in DV, unlike other crime. She mostly just wants to be safe. She wants to be free from violence. In many cases, they're intimate partners for a reason. They love each other. She just doesn't want to be the victim of physical violence. Finally, DV is predictable and preventable in ways that other crimes is not. We know there's going to be, muggings and robberies and theft and larceny and all that stuff. We don't know where it's going to happen, who. DV is not like that. DV, we know where it's going to happen. If it's happened before in a household, it's more likely to happen there. If it's never happened in a household, it's probably never going to in the future. It's predictable. It follows standard patterns of escalation. I'll get to that eventually. So the second problem with the current system, victims are responsible for their own protection. Why doesn't she leave? This is the question, if you deal with domestic violence, you will be asked. It is usually the first question you get asked all the time. She's responsible for her own protection, so why doesn't she leave? Well, the first answer is oftentimes she does. We just don't hear about it. Lots of women leave every day. They leave violent relationships. They don't necessarily call the police. They don't necessarily involve anyone else. They just